up a chair this week is Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of the new book, Imposter No More, where she writes about her own struggles with imposter syndrome and provides science backed strategies to overcome feelings of self doubt. As an award winning teacher, TEDx speaker, and co host of the popular Psychologists Off the Clock podcast, I love that, she makes complex psychological concepts really accessible. Jill, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Cicely. Thank you so much for having me.
This is going to be a fun conversation because I don't even want to spoil it. I'm going to wait until we jump in to kind of give you some questions. But this topic of imposter syndrome just comes up in so many conversations. So let me just start by asking, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, you know what they say, research is me search, right?
I love that.
And where it really came from is, I had had these experiences of imposter thoughts and feelings for a long time, but I think, when I first started graduate school, I just assumed they were normal, but that as I racked up achievements, of course, I would outgrow this at some point. And that just turned out to not be the case at all. And the more I started talking to people, the more I realized that this is correlated with success, that often the more successful people are, the more they experience this feeling. And that just fascinated me. I thought, your portfolio should help you talk yourself out of this, and it just doesn't. So that's why I decided to dig a little bit deeper and then write a book for other achievers who might be experiencing this as well.
That's interesting. Well, I have to admit, I laughed when you talked about the story about your dad at the beginning of the book, because I was giving a keynote speech recently and I mentioned imposter syndrome, and a gentleman in the back raises his hand like he's just like reaching for the sky. And I'm like, oh, wow, this guy's got a great question. And he says, what is imposter syndrome? And I stopped for a second and I was like, I'm thinking, wait, how does he not know what that is? But then I'm like, I love that he doesn't know what that is. So, what is imposter syndrome, and why do you suggest not even calling it that? You want to say imposter feelings or imposterism. So, walk us through what it is, but also why are we using the wrong phrase to describe it?
Yeah. Well, so imposter quote unquote syndrome is an experience of intellectual phoniness or inadequacy where you think at any minute people are going to discover that you're a fraud, that you're not really as competent or knowledgeable or skilled as they think you are. It might be because you think you achieved some position or award or, group standing because of people just being nice or nepotism or, really any number of luck even, but that you don't truly deserve to be where you are. Why I don't think it should be called a syndrome, and this is certainly not my original idea. Other people have been talking about this out in the ether, but there's two reasons. One is this is incredibly common. And the science behind this is not great. Like, you can do a Google search and get millions and millions of hits, but the scientific databases, there's not actually a ton out there on imposterism. And so the prevalence rates vary massively, but some estimates are over 80%. And so we really don't know how prevalent it is, but it's incredibly common. And so if that's the case, then it just cannot possibly be a pathology or disease or disorder. That just doesn't make sense because it's just normal. But the other reason, and again, this is an empirical question that, to my knowledge, as of today, has not been fully supported. But so this is just a hypothesis, but it appears to be possible that people who have had experiences of marginalization may be more vulnerable to developing these thoughts and feelings. And this makes sense at a common sense level, right? So like, if women have been told they don't belong at men's tables, if people of color have been told they don't belong at white tables, if LGBTQI plus population has been told they don't belong at cis straight tables, et cetera, then it would make sense that you would question whether you belong at the tables. And so that also means this is not a disease or a disorder or a pathology. This is a normal experience that happens as a result of social and cultural experiences. So I think we need to get rid of syndrome. And incidentally, the psychologists who developed this or who identified the phenomenon in the late 1970s, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, they called it the imposter phenomenon. And at that time, they believed that it only occurred in high achieving women. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that something that was thought to only occur in women suddenly got rebranded in our social culture as a syndrome, right? Oh, like if the ladies are feeling insecure, then they must have some disease or pathology, right?
Right. That's exactly. Now that you say that, okay, light bulb moment's gone off. You're like, right. Wait a minute. Why is it called
Yeah.
a syndrome? But I have to admit, I researched imposterism, but I had never seen the straight line or the correlation drawn to the marginalization. That is such a powerful point. And maybe that explains why 80%, up to 80%, maybe more, but the marginalization piece, because I was quite surprised, and I'd love for you to kind of expound on the marginalization piece, but also, what do you say to people who are like, I don't know what that is. I've never experienced it. Like, what's your answer?
Oh goodness. Well, that's a good question. I hate it when that happens because to be perfectly honest, I get scared to respond to
Mm,
that. And I'll give you one example. I before the book even came out, so I'm not even sure how this happened, but some people can read an early copy through NetGalley or something. And so
mhm.
I think I had 4 or 5 reviews. I think it was 5. 4 of them were excellent. One of them was a 1-star review. So my book hasn't even come out yet. And one of them is a 1-star review with Kevin. And part of the reason for that was because it just wasn't the book he wanted to read. He wanted a book that was going to boost his confidence and get rid of his anxiety. And you read the book, Cicely, so you know that is not what this book is really about. And if I could
Yeah.
do that, I would. And lots of books claim to. And we can talk about what this book is about instead. So that was part of it. But the other part of it was he really took issue with the fact that I talk about marginalization and who is
Oh.
and isn't more vulnerable to this experience. And so it's a difficult conversation to have because I
Mm,
think there are buzzwords like privilege
mhm,
or
mhm,
that people tend to have a strong
mhm.
negative reaction to. Um, so, luckily it hasn't happened too often because I rarely talk to people who haven't experienced imposterism about
Sure.
imposterism. So it doesn't come up that much among people who haven't been marginalized. And I also think it's important to point out that you can be a straight cis white male and still have had these experiences. And
Mhm,
there's of course other groups too, if you're disabled, if you're an
mhm.
immigrant, right? But even if you're an older male working in technology, that's an area that you could experience marginalization. If you're a stay at home dad, you might have those imposter feelings among
Mhm.
mothers, right? So there are lots of ways that even if you are in most majority groups, you can certainly still have this experience.
That's a great point. And I found it fascinating, not that I had a visceral reaction, but instead of, oh, I've never thought about that when it came to imposter, because you're right, we tend to think of it or hear about it in terms of high achievers, but in fact, it can impact anyone,
Mhm.
in any area of life. But you just said something really key. So let me go off that. My nature, as we were joking about before we jumped on, is to go really deep and to jump into some of these topics. But I'm gonna resist that temptation right now. And you just said, let's talk about what this book is about. What is it about? What is your high level overview before we jump into types and topics that are inside of it? What do you want people to know that this book is about? What should
Yeah.
the one review Kevin, the 1-star Kevin, what should he know about this book before he jumps in?
Yeah. Um, so what makes this book different is every other book that is out there about battling imposter syndrome is like build your confidence and think
Mhm,
positively about yourself. And there is quite a bit of research to suggest that the more we try to control our thoughts and feelings, the bigger they become. And so, what this book does instead is teach people to change their relationship to those internal experiences. So, instead of trying to convince myself that I'm good enough, right? Like, I mean, we can give an example to listeners. If your listeners think about, like, okay, I'm a fraud, I'm inadequate, I'm not competent enough. I could sit here with your resume and read off all of the things that sort of prove objective evidence that you're amazing. And what is your brain going to do? it's going to go, well, yeah, but this, and yeah, but that, right? Like, and that is the way our brain tries to protect us from failure,
Mhm.
humiliation, rejection, etc. And, so there is research again that shows the more we try to push this stuff away, the bigger it tends to become. And so the alternative is changing our relationship to those things. And so part of that is learning how to make space for difficult feelings and to get some distance from our thoughts. And so in those new spaces, we can make choices that instead of being driven by thoughts or feelings, we're making choices based on values. So that's who we want to be, what we want to stand for, the life we want to live, what would bring us meaning or fulfillment. And the fancy word for all of that is psychological flexibility.
Yes. And I love that. When I read that, I was circling and highlighting and making notes to come back to that because I have to admit, and I do want to get into psychological flexibility and mindfulness and some of the pieces that you get into. But the point you make about those internal experiences is pretty important. I actually found myself thinking, well, even not even in an imposter moment, there's still a need to get in touch with some of those internal experiences. And so I found myself really extrapolating even some of the parts of the book to just everyday interactions, whether you feel like an imposter or not. But how are you mindful? How are you present? And I know I'm jumping way ahead and I'm going to resist the temptation, but I appreciated that you deconstruct the topic in a way that I've never read or approached before. And it really resonated. So I know the listeners and the folks in our community are going to love this because you do approach it in a very fundamentally different way, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that, gosh, if I could have people take 1 or 2 points home, one would be, we are creatures that are built to avoid pain. If you put your hand on a hot stove, you're going to remove your hand. And that's a good thing. It's how you avoid a
Mhm.
dangerous burn. But, then we apply that same logic to our inner world. And it doesn't work that way, nor should it. Because the way I like to think about this is if anyone who's listening right now thinks about like the last time something kept you up at night, either you couldn't fall asleep or you woke up at 2 a.m. and the wheels are spinning, consider what it was you were worrying about. It most likely was not whether Ted Lasso is coming back for a fourth season, even if that was your favorite show of all time, right? We worry about the stuff we care deeply about,
Yeah.
right? And so if we didn't care about it, we wouldn't feel anxious or worried about being outed as frauds or anything else like that. And so instead of that emotional pain being a sign that we should like run and jump into our comfort zone, really it's like a bright red neon arrow saying you're exactly where you're supposed to be and that this may be something we want to lean into, not run away from. And of course that's easier said than done, and that's really what the whole book is about, is how to do that when that's not the way we typically
Mhm.
navigate our world.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I have to, yeah, I so want to go there. I'm not going to go there. I so want to go there. I'll come back to that point because there's just so, oh my gosh, there's so much to talk about. But let's jump into Imposter No More because most people don't know that there are actual subtypes of imposterism. And I knew this because I had coached on it before and studied it before, but I always find myself reading these subtypes going, dang it, that's me. Okay, well, that was me too. And then I think, God, no reason I'm so screwed up. I'm like 3 out of the 5 or 4 out of the 5. So let me just not even jump into which ones those are. Why don't you tell us what the subtypes of imposterism are and how they manifest themselves
Yeah.
in people?
So these are categories that were identified by Valerie Young, who wrote a book a
Mhm.
while ago called "The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women." And so her approach to imposterism is very different than mine, but she is the
Mhm.
one who identified these subtypes. And really, what they are is um, they're ways that we attempt to avoid being outed as frauds, ways we attempt to prove our confidence. I mean, sorry, ways we attempt to prove our competence so that we are not outed as the imposters we fear we are. And of course, they always tend to fall apart. And so the first is the perfectionist, and that's pretty self explanatory, right? You have very high standards,
Mhm.
you do everything at the highest level, but of any kind of mistake is seen as failure. And this means that you're a fraud. And of course, everybody makes mistakes at different times. So that's bound to happen. There is the expert, and this is me. This is the person who needs to have like all the knowledge and the skills and the expertise and the experience to feel good enough. So it's lots of classes and books and podcasts
Mhm.
and learning, learning, learning. And not that there's anything wrong with learning or skill building, but this person tends to do that without doing the doing, right? So they get sort of stuck in this constant learning mode and not really doing. Next is the natural genius. This is a person who thinks like either you've got it or you don't, that intelligence is innate. And if you can't pick something up quickly, instantly, learn it the first time, this proves you're incompetent and a fraud. There's the soloist. So accomplishments only count if I do it by myself, and needing to ask for help is evidence I'm a fraud. And then the superhuman is my favorite because I always get the image of a person who is pedaling a unicycle, juggling flaming pins, all while smiling, unruffled. And of course, at some point, one of those pins is going to fall. And then this is proof that they're a fraud in their minds. And they think if I truly were competent, I should be able to balance plates on my nose while I'm doing all of those other things too.
Yeah, I love that. I love that visual. I always tend to the superhuman being in a cape. And,
Yeah.
I immediately go to yes, the person who can do it all and save the world and those pieces. But, you said I think you said you were the expert. So
Mhm.
can you be more than one type, or are people generally just manifesting it in one way?
Definitely. So most people will see themselves in more than one,
Okay.
but one usually tends to be dominant. And I
Okay.
actually, now this is not scientific. This is just something I did with help, input from some colleagues, but I created a quiz so that people can identify their subtypes if they want to. And it gives you a percentage. Like if you're 68% expert and 30% natural genius. And that's just on my website. It's just jillstoddard.com/quizzes.
Awesome. Listen, oh, okay. I got it. Okay. Not that I wasn't feeling bad about myself already, thinking I'm like 3 out of the 5. Now I got to go take the quiz. That quiz.
Take
Okay.
the
So say that
quiz.
again. It's jillstoddard.com
Yep, /quizzes. And then
slash
it'll give you
quizzes.
the percentage. So what your top one is and then what some of the other ones are.
I might have to have a glass of wine when I do that quiz. I might need therapy after that. I may be calling you going, "Oh my god, guess what it said?" That's awesome. I love that I'd never heard of a quiz like that. So that's great.
Mhm.
I'm sure our listeners, and we'll make sure we drop that in the show notes, but also when I
Great.
post about the episode, I'll make sure we point folks to that because that's pretty powerful to know exactly where you are in terms of a sliding scale of the different types.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, awareness of all of these things is really the first step to change, right? We do so much on autopilot that this is like awareness is not sufficient for change, but it is a necessary first step to change. And so I think, the subtypes lend some information there.
Well, and it's almost like you're leading me through this, and I love it because getting off of autopilot is something you talk about, and you just said autopilot.
Mhm.
And maybe that relates to your points about mindfulness, but the reason I wanted to go over the 5 types is because this book is full of actionable strategies about how to get past imposterism or how to deal with it or what does it mean when those feelings show up. So I love that you say, okay, here's what it is, but really, let's talk about what it means, how it manifests itself, and what are the strategies you need to deal with imposterism. So that's really the pivot I want to make. So why is getting off autopilot so important in that conversation? And then we'll go back to the psychological flexibility point you made earlier.
Okay, well, they're very related for sure. And the I don't know if I should say it's the opposite of psychological flexibility, but what we often do because we're diving for our comfort zone or we're just
Mhm.
listening to what our mind is telling us as if our thoughts are, truth with a capital T, is we have a thought or a feeling and we just respond. I'm snapping, not that anyone can see me, but we just react on autopilot. I like to use, it's a little, I mean, maybe it's too violent, but I like to use this metaphor of a detonator and a bomb because we all know what the metaphor "it pushes my buttons" means, right? We have that common language. And so if you think about all the stuff in your environment that pushes your
Mhm.
buttons, whatever that stuff is, we often just react without even considering the person that we
Exactly.
want to be. And
Mhm.
so what that present moment awareness does is like if you picture a detonator and a bomb, and for anyone who's like Gen X or older, the old school, what is it, Roadrunner cartoon, like that kind of like TNT. So the
That's exactly what I
fuse,
thought about.
right? I know, me too. I draw that drawing in my talks that I give,
I
actually. And
love
so
it.
what often happens is there's no fuse. The detonator gets pushed and the bomb goes off. And what present moment awareness allows is it basically creates that longer detonator so that there's space between the time our button gets pushed and the bomb goes off, right? And so if in that space we can dismantle that bomb using psychological flexibility skills, like which we can talk about, but like acceptance and basically changing your relationship to your thoughts and your feelings. And so, autopilot is that button gets pushed, bomb goes off, and we want to create more
Yeah.
space so that instead we're consciously, deliberately choosing the person we want to be and the life we want to live.
And there's so much to go into with just that analogy because, yes, I laugh because that's exactly what came to mind when I read it, but also because it's so true. Like, I kind of snapped my fingers when I read it too. Of like, there's just that instantaneous response and not that space for the mindfulness of our feelings or our internal
Yeah.
experiences. And I mean, I felt a little guilty reading that 'cause I was like, oh man, I need this. I need this right now. Like, this is so helpful. So then, if you say that's the opposite or kind of related to psychological safety, I'm sorry, psychological flexibility, not safety, flexibility, then take us down that theme as well.
So psychological flexibility is really it's very simple, but it's not easy to do. But simply put, it is our ability to be in this present moment because the last one is gone and the next one has yet to happen. So this is the only one we have. To be in this present moment with all of our thoughts, emotions, physiological sensations, urges, without doing anything to change them, suppress them, get rid of them, etc. And to consciously deliberately choose what we're going to do or not do based on our values. And values are just who you want to be, what you want to be about, the life that you want to live, the qualities you want to embody, and that's pretty much it. And so like I said, it's a simple concept, but of course it's not always easy in practice, and it's also not a goal. Like you don't wake up one day and go, "Oh, I've done it. I'm psychologically flexible." It's a process. It's something that we return to, day after day after day after day.
Mhm. Well, and I appreciated that you went a little further into that explanation because, and I'm sorry, I'm going to call out page 234 here, because I was taking notes about psychologically flexible living, and you say I like to think of psychologically flexible living as showing up to each moment as your personally chosen, fully authentic self.
Yeah.
And then you give us the PAVE acronym about, hey guys, just FYI, here's how you do this every day. And
Mhm.
so what are the PAVE steps and how does that help us remember those psychological flexibility skills? Because I found myself thinking, oh good, she gave me the shortcut. Now I know exactly how I'm supposed to be doing this every day. So what does PAVE stand for?
Yeah, and I liked this word pave specifically because I think of this as like a journey, like we're moving along a
Exactly.
path, right? And
Mhm.
the path can feel really uh bumpy and lots of roots and like you're going to trip. And so psychological flexibility can help like pave that path a little bit. And so the P is for pause, and then I cheated. I also added get present. So pause and present can both be the P. So pause, get present, like stop thinking about the last minute or the next minute and be here in this moment. The A stands for accept, and another term for that is willingness. So acceptance and willingness are interchangeable, and the reason I say that is sometimes people go, whoa, accept, I don't want to accept how I feel. But what this means is to make space and be willing to experience your feelings, your emotions, your physiological sensations, your urges that are already there anyway. So it's not giving up or giving in or resignation. It's allowing something that's already present to just be as it is. So that's what acceptance means. So that's the A. V is values. So identify the me you want to be in this one moment and notice the word moment what's the word right in the middle of that word is me, right? So
Mhm.
I visualize the word moment with a capital me in the middle. Who's the me I want to be in this one moment? That's your values. And then E is execute, because identifying values is great, but now you have to actually move your hands and your feet and your mouth, basically to walk the talk. And so that's the execute, is walking the talk.
So is the key question of who is the me I want to be in this moment? Is that the question we should be asking ourselves when imposterism starts to manifest itself? So should we walk through the pave in our head and go, okay, PAVE, but really ask ourselves, who is the me I want to be in this moment?
Yeah, that's 100% it. That is truly it. And sometimes it can be hard to get in touch with that. So, one of my favorite ways to do this. Am I jumping ahead? Can I share this? One of my
No,
favorite
please,
ways to do this? Okay.
please.
So I had a client once who came in and she was all excited because she had done a great job of practicing these PAVE skills all week. And I said, "Well, what was the secret? How were you so successful?" And she said, "Well, I just thought WWJD." And I thought she meant, what would Jesus do? And I start to go into a shame spiral because I didn't know that she was religious. And then she said, "What would Jill do?" And I was like, "Oh, thank God." And so now I use that with people, and I believe it's in the book too. And you get to pick your J. Of course, not everyone needs to make me their J, and it could be Jesus if you're religious, but it can be someone like a coach or a grandparent. It could be a celebrity who you feel like you know. It could be even a fictional character. And so you ask yourself, when you're in a position to make a difficult decision and you're overwhelmed with difficult thoughts and feelings, you can ask yourself, what would this person do? So for me, I had the opportunity to do a TEDx talk,
Mhm.
and I was terrified. And I have these very old childhood wounds where my parents used to call me Tubby and Little Tubbet and Tubby 2x4. And so I'm very raw when it comes to issues of weight and body, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so this was during COVID, and I had gained a lot of weight during COVID. And of course, rationally, I know this shouldn't matter, but emotionally, this was very difficult for me.
Yeah.
And I just thought, there's no way I can do this and memorialize myself on video at a time that I'm feeling crushing insecurity. And truly, this is a true story. But this was like a professional bucket list dream come true opportunity. And I truly did say, okay, well, my J is Oprah Winfrey, because she's overcome every obstacle and she's a badass and she doesn't let her body get in the way of things she does. And I
Mhm.
thought, well, what would Oprah do? And it was a no brainer. Like, of course she would do the talk. And then I extended it and I thought, well, if she knew I was suffering in this way, what might Oprah say to me? And I thought, and
Mm.
I get choked up every time I think of this. And I think Oprah would say, "Jill, you are so much more than your body. And if you have
Mm.
a message to share that helps even one person, this is your professional mission. This is you being psychologically flexible. You have to do it." And that was it.
Mm.
Decision made. And I think what's really key here is I didn't try to get more
Wow.
confident. I didn't try to convince myself it's my place to do. I really thought I did not have a message worth sharing. What's the TED the logo, not the logo, the saying, oh my gosh. Anyway, it's not message worth sharing, but it's something like that. An idea worth sharing. It wasn't
Yes,
that
that's
hard,
it.
right?
I'm
Okay.
sure we
So
can rack
I
my brain too going, what is it? What is it? What
get
is
rid of
it?
all that. Yeah. So I didn't believe that I had an idea that was worth
Wow.
sharing. I had all of the self doubt. I didn't think I deserved it. I thought that I was just given a spot that probably everybody got one because she was desperate to fill the slots, not because my idea was worth sharing. It was only 11 minutes instead of 18, and most people would take their full eight. I mean, the inner critic was so loud and I was so anxious. And I chose to do it anyway because I wanted to be about bravery and courage and persistence and sharing a message that would hopefully give something to others, making a contribution. Those were my values. And I
Mm.
cared deeply about this. So to think I should be able to do it with confidence and no self doubt is just sort of ridiculous. I mean, it's completely unrealistic. And so I had to do it in the presence of that pain. And that's what
Wow.
so much of this book is about, is how to do that.
So when that inner critic is really loud And I mean, is that one of the simple tricks? Is the WWJD or WWOD? Is that one of the tricks you can do? Because you're right. So many people say, well, just get confident or just get rid of your imposter feelings. And you're like, they're there. They're not going away. You've got to deal with them. The question is, how do you deal with them? So that actually is a very powerful, I'm going to write that down. The WWJD, Jill, you're going to be on Jill. It's going to be Jesus. It's going to be Oprah. I'm going to just fill in the blank. But what are the other, I guess, I don't want to say simple because it's not simple, but what are the other mindsets that you can, what are the other steps you can do to change your
Yeah.
mindset in that moment? Because that's a powerful one that we've all heard, but I guess I never thought about it in terms of imposterism or the critic. So what are some of the other tips that we can
Yeah.
do to really be present in that moment to change those thoughts?
So that WWJDOD, et cetera, that's the V in PAVE. That's a way to get clear
Mhm.
on your values.
Mhm.
Another one I love that is actually kind of quick and simple is to think about an epitaph that you might want written on your
Mhm.
gravestone. And this could be what it would be if you were being psychologically inflexible and what it would be
Mhm.
if you were being psychologically flexible. So, here lies Cicely. She was very good at playing it safe so that she would never fail or risk rejection. Like, ew, right?
Yep.
Or here lies Cicely. She took risks even when she was terrified so that she could live boldly even when sometimes she failed. Something along those lines. It's like what would you want that pithy little saying to say about, and of course these are sayings that are like on a gravestone after you've died. So
Sure.
this is like what would you have wanted to stand for during the time in this one life that you got to live. So that's the V values. We talked about the P pause. You got to be aware that you're suffering in the first place. You have to be aware of the thoughts and the feelings that are showing up, which we usually are. So then another skill is the accept. And this is simply put, getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And if I could teach humans literally just one thing that I think would change their life, it would be getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Because think about all the choices you make to avoid discomfort, right?
Yeah.
We procrastinate because we're uncomfortable. We overwork because we're uncomfortable. We avoid difficult conversations and social situations, and so on, and so on, and so on. And how many people out there want to write a book or do a podcast or a TED Talk, and they don't because it's uncomfortable. So the A for accept is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Now, if I said to you, "Oh, just go do the TED Talk," most people wouldn't do that, and neither did I. I had been practicing these skills for nearly 20 years at this point. And so, one thing you can do, I sort of compare it like if you told me you wanted to run a marathon and you hadn't been a runner at this point, I wouldn't say, "Great, let's go do 26.2 on Saturday," right? Like you would train with easier runs and work your way up. So, one of the ways I like to do this is by using the senses. And so, we can actually do this together as long as listeners are not driving in the car. So, if you fold your hands the way that feels natural, or your arms, like cross your arms, do it the way that feels natural and just notice how that feels.
Yeah.
And then switch your fingers so they're one off. So now it's like the funny feeling way. And
Okay.
notice how that feels. And especially notice how bad you want to uncross your fingers and switch them back to the other way. And that's what we need to accept.
Huh.
Instead of reacting on autopilot and going, "Oh, I don't like it," and undoing it. So you can use your breath to do this because notice when you inhale, you're literally expanding, right? So you can use
Mhm.
that expansion to make space for discomfort. And when you exhale, you can let go of resistance, not letting go of the discomfort, but letting go of the unwillingness to have the discomfort. And so this is something we can do with all five of our senses. You can eat foods you don't like. You can listen to music you don't like. I love to play Bean Boozled, the jelly bean game where, you get a pink one and it might be pomegranate or it might be dirty bandage, but they're just jelly beans, right? You can brush your teeth with your non dominant hand. You can do anything out of order. If you normally put your left shoe on before your right, you can do it the other way. And all of this is just practice getting comfortable being uncomfortable so that you can then work your way up to whatever your 26.2 version of discomfort would be. I also like to encourage people to do things like riding amusement park rides they might not normally ride,
Ooh.
watching YouTube clips. So, like, the last 5 minutes of Marley and Me. Oof, for me, it's jump scares and scary
Yeah.
movies.
Yeah.
Right? Those are tough, but you're trying to do it without resistance. You're opening up, you're allowing these experiences. So you're trying to trigger discomfort and then shift your relationship to it so that instead of running away, you're learning to open up and make space and just let it be. They're just feelings. They're uncomfortable, but they're not dangerous. They're temporary and you can handle it. Like that is the mantra that we all need to have. That is basically the relationship we need to start having to our feelings. It's uncomfortable. I may not like it, but it's here and it's not dangerous and it's temporary and I can handle it.
Okay, so I had to unfold my hands because it felt it was uncomfortable, and I kept wanting to think, no, 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 go back to where it was. Okay, all right, so much there because you just hit me on the the scary movies, the roller coaster. No, no thank you. No,
So
thank
you
you.
can work your way up. If roller
Yes,
coasters are like your 25-mile mark, then you
yeah,
don't do that in the beginning.
yeah. I got some
You
work
do
to
as
do.
much as you're willing.
I've got some homework, but you just so it's the resistance then, right? It's the resistance
Exactly.
to the discomfort that I mean, like I'm right like right now my heart is just racing because you mentioned roller coasters and scary movies and I'm thinking, "Oh dear lord, those are mine."
Yeah.
But now I'm thinking, well, I'm resisting, so the resisting makes the discomfort worse. And I think you gave a formula.
I
Pain
did.
times resistance equals suffering. So the more we resist, the more it hurts or the more discomfort hurts?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So, this is really from Buddhism and maybe other ancient Eastern practices. But the idea is that to have pain is to be human, right? Like we
Mhm.
literally
Sure.
come out of the womb screaming. And if we're not, it means something's terribly wrong, right? So to be a human being is to have pain. That is just part of the deal. But resistance is optional. And if we can turn down the dial on resistance, then we turn down suffering. And so, an example of resistance, and what we would call this in acceptance and commitment therapy and with psychological flexibility, is experiential avoidance. And this is really anything that we're doing or not doing to try to control the way that we feel. Now, if we're avoiding and there's no cost, that might be fine. So, for example, let's say it's raining and you decide to use an umbrella. Well, that's going to make it so that you're less wet and less cold. So technically,
Mhm.
that's avoidance. But is it bad? Well, if you're just walking down the street in your neighborhood, it probably has no cost and you're fine. However, let's say you are at a baseball or football game or an outdoor concert with 50,000 other people and it starts to rain. And now you decide you're going to put up your gigantic umbrella and you're bumping into the people next to you and blocking the view of the people behind you. If your values are such that you care about your community and being thoughtful and considerate, now this is coming at a cost to your values. So it's sort of an it depends situation. But other
Okay.
examples of avoidance are, drugs, alcohol, food, shopping, gambling.
Mhm.
Those are some obvious ones. Procrastination, overworking or overachieving, skin picking. It's really like anything that we're doing to try to change or control the way that we feel. And so if that has a cost, then the alternative is acceptance or willingness, learning this ability to open up and let that discomfort just be with you, kind of like a passenger in your
Mhm.
car. And if that passenger's saying like, "Stop, pull over, go left, go right," and you're listening to it, then you're not going to be on the journey you want to be on. So can you, or I sometimes think of it as like you've got like five annoying kindergartners in the back who they're not going to be quiet no matter how much you tell them to be quiet, right? And so can you keep on driving in the directions that matter to you even with that racket going on in the background?
Well, that's such a yeah, okay. That's such a great point. But then it all comes okay. So if you had to I don't want to say sum up because that's not fair because that there's so much and for everybody listening, community, listen, Imposter the book is by Dr. Jill Stoddard. It's called Imposter No More. We are scratching the surface here. But Jill, if I were to say mindfulness, really the key one of the keys or maybe the main key is mindfulness when the imposterism, when the self doubt, when the fear, when the resistance, when it's just all too much, Is it being present and mindful? Is that the pivot point then that you need to start to do PAVE and the other strategies you talked about? Is it the mindfulness piece that so often we miss?
I think mindfulness has sort of been corrupted into this thing that, oh, just do this and everything will magically make you feel better. And that is absolutely not the role of mindfulness in this context.
Good point.
Mindfulness is really just being aware of the present moment, hopefully without judgment, although we can't really control that. So it's when we notice we're judging, letting go of judgment. But it's like paying attention to the present moment, hopefully without judgment. And the reason for that is not to feel good or feel better. It's to create that space. It's to
Mhm.
lengthen that fuse so that you can make a conscious, deliberate choice that is values consistent instead of just reacting, right? It's choosing a response instead of reacting from a place of discomfort. And that's really all that it's about. It's not a magic formula that's going to like fix and
Right.
cure everything, but it's a practice that makes choice more available.
Okay, I love that reframe. That's a powerful reframe. That awareness, presence. I love that. So then, for the person who is just who's listening to this and they're like, "Well, this is all great," but when those moments of imposterism and the self doubt and like when it's just palpable and they can't really get their hands or their arms around the feelings of it, the TED talk, oh my gosh, I can't do this. There's no way. That's a lot of people. So
Yeah.
and look, we've all been there. You said you've been there. I've been there. That was my
Mhm.
first thought when I got the TEDx email, in my email inbox. I was like, that's a mistake.
You're
That's
right.
that's gotta clearly somebody sent that to the wrong Cicely. That was not supposed to be to me. I don't know what they were thinking. Um, can it become paralyzing if we don't act on it?
Absolutely. I think it's all about, if we think of this as a cluster of thoughts, I who do I think I am? I'm not good enough. I don't deserve this, etc., as well as feelings that come with that, anxiety, uncertainty. It's when we respond. So the thoughts and the feelings are not the problem. Going back to what you were asking about resistance, the thoughts and the feelings are the pain, and that pain times resistance equals
Mhm.
suffering. The pain are the thoughts and the feelings. The resistance is how we choose to respond. We don't control that thoughts and feelings happen. They happen. That's part of being human. But we choose how to respond. If we
Mm.
respond from a place of listening to our thoughts, believing our thoughts, and running from our feelings, then certainly it can become paralyzing. Or the opposite, it can get us on this like hamster wheel of achievement. Like, if I just do this thing or this thing or this thing, then I'll feel legitimate, right? And that just doesn't seem to be the case. We can't outrun it. And so that can lead to burnout. So either we're missing out and because, like you said, paralyzed, or we're burning out. And so the
Mm.
key is this idea of like, okay, I'm noticing those thoughts and feelings. I'm getting clear on what my values are, and I'm going to choose to move in that direction in the presence of pain. We didn't talk a lot about what to do with the thoughts specifically and
Please,
what we
yeah,
want to
let's
do
go there.
there. So we get hooked by these thoughts, like they're truths with a
Mhm.
capital T, right? And what we want to do is unhook or sort of detach. And similar to mindfulness, this is a way to create space so that we can choose how we're going to respond. So when a thought shows up, we want to acknowledge that we're having a thought and then ask ourselves, if I respond to this thought, is that going to move me closer to my values or further away? So let's say you have the
Mm.
thought, oh, shoot, my rent is due tomorrow. That's assuming you care about keeping a roof over your head. That's probably a thought that you want to listen to and respond to by paying your rent. If that thought says,
Yeah.
oh, I have nothing meaningful to share or to say, and that makes you shut down in a meeting, even if you have ideas that are probably very valuable, and you want to be the kind of person who is brave or open or contributing, then that's moving you away from your values if you listen to that thought. And so, one strategy we can use to try to detach from that kind of thinking is, I mean, there's lots of different strategies. One is very simple. So everyone who's listening, just think of any thought that gives you trouble. And so most of us have some version of an I'm not good enough story.
Mhm.
So if you think of whatever your version of that is, so say that thought out loud or to yourself. So, like, I'm not good enough, and notice how it feels. And then say, I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, and notice how that feels. And then try, I'm noticing I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough, and see how that feels.
Ah.
So what did you notice, Cicely?
The detachment. I'm
Yeah.
further removed away from. Oh, wow.
And so it's not convincing you, indeed, you are good enough, right? You still might feel scared and uncertain, but now you can see this thought for what it is, which is
Uh-huh.
just a thought, right? Thoughts are images, they're sounds, they're syllables. They don't actually have power other than the power we give them. And so the other way that we can practice with this is to take our thoughts a little less seriously. And this is going to sound silly, and it is, but that's on purpose because we're trying to like deflate the power that we give these thoughts. So you might put your thoughts into like a Google Translate online,
Mhm.
right? And have that thought said in a language that's not your native language. It's the exact same meaning, but it won't be powerful because that's not a language you speak. So what does that tell you about how
Wow.
important that thought should be, right? You can have like a robot voice generator say the thought back to you. You can sing it. You can imagine Homer Simpson saying it. And so that sounds, again, like it sounds silly, and it is because it's hard to take, you're so average and mediocre, you'll never amount to anything seriously if Homer Simpson is saying it and ending with dope. Right? You're like, oh, right. Maybe I don't need to take myself so seriously. I used to have a client, I loved
So
this.
true.
She used to say, I just started telling myself, she was like in her early 20s. She said, it's not that deep. And I was like, oh, I love that. Right? Like she'd have
Huh.
these thoughts that feel so strong and compelling. And she'd just say to herself, it's not that deep. Like don't take yourself so darn seriously. Just go do the thing.
Wow.
Isn't that
Wow.
cute?
And you're like, really? That's it? It's not that. Okay. All right.
And so when
See?
when I got my 1-star review from Kevin, I now talk back to my thoughts by saying, not today, Kevin.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
So you can also name your inner critic,
Oh,
right?
I
My
love
inner
that.
critic used to be Sheila till just a few days ago or 2 weeks ago when I got that review. So you can say like, okay, it could be a person's name or it can be the bully, the dictator, whatever. And you say, okay, listen, Kevin, I know you're just trying to protect me from humiliation and failure and rejection,
So
but I got,
awesome.
I got this. I got it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're kind
Well,
of putting it over to the side. So
that's
your
so
other homework
true.
is to come up with a name for your inner critic,
Well, I
Cicely.
was going to ask you why you chose Sheila. So I'm glad you brought us back
No
to the thoughts.
idea.
'Cause I was also going to say what other pieces, because there are many pieces we haven't touched on. But I love that. I love just that immediate, just, silence. It's not that deep. Not today, Kevin. I got to figure out the name for mine.
Mhm.
That hits me. That resonates with me because you're right. As you were doing that language exercise, you do feel further away from it. It doesn't feel like it has its grip on you. And the Google Translate analogy is pretty cool. But I love that you can name it, and by
Yeah.
naming it, you can tame it. And
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
love. Okay, all right. See,
Or
I'm so
even
glad
like
to
if
do
I
all this
said to
work.
you, like if
I
you
can come
say
back and
right
work.
now, I cannot raise my hand, right? And now go like this. I'm raising my hand for people who can't see me, right? I
Yeah.
can't raise my hand. I can't possibly keep my hand in there. Like it is possible to think one way and still choose to act another. It's not easy. And it takes practice, lots of practice, but it is 100% within reach for everybody.
Well, I think that's a key distinction is that our thoughts only have power if we give them the power, and we
Mhm.
decide what that looks like. To your point, you can think one thing and do something else. That seems so simple, but so hard when
Yeah.
that fuse and that bomb are so close together, and that's powerful. That is so powerful. So let me ask you this: I had a mom come up to me, and I had a mom come up to me, and she said, "How do I not pass on bad habits like imposter syndrome to my children?" I
Mm.
looked at her and I was like, "Oh, well, that that's a whole thing, right? But that was her takeaway when she heard me talking about it was, how do I not instill the bad habits I have into my kids? How would you answer that question?
Yeah. Well, I think the most powerful thing we can do is modeling. Right?
Okay.
It's modeling. So I'll give you an example. This was like my favorite thing that happened all summer. So I have tried to get up on water. This has nothing to do with being an imposter, but you'll see where I'm going with this. I have tried to get up on water skis almost every summer since I was a little girl. So truly 40 years. And I have never, not once, ever come close to standing up on water skis. And this year, I had to make a decision whether I wanted to try again. And I turned 50 this year and I have a bad shoulder. And all I thought was, this seems like a terrible decision. Like, I'm probably going to, and I even had people say to me, I don't think you should do it. What if you really injure yourself really badly? And then you can't do the other things. Like, I love Pilates and yoga. And like, what if you're out of
Mhm.
commission? And what if you need surgery? So lots of people really worrying about this. And I thought, yeah, but what if I do it? Like,
What if?
what
Yeah.
if I do it and I get to say the year I finally got up on skis was the year I turned 50 after 40 years of failing? But most importantly, if I had been doing this in a vacuum, I don't know if I would have done it. The
Wow.
reason I did it is because my children were there. And I wanted them to see that no matter how many times I failed, I'm going to keep trying because it's not that big a deal to fail. Like, it feels a little bad for a minute, but I want to be about effort and perseverance and courage even if I don't get the outcome that I want. And so I decided to try. And I failed a few times and then I got up for 6 seconds and it was like the best 6 seconds of my life. The next day I tried again and I freaking did it. I did a whole entire run. It was 2.5 minutes. I never even
Wow.
fell. I let go because I got so tired after 2.5 minutes. It is a lot harder than it looks. I'll tell you that. And my kids, they're all in the boat. Not I have 2 children. That made it sound like I have 17 kids. They are screaming and yelling. And for 3 days after, my son, my 9-year-old son, kept coming up to me going, Mommy, you did it. Can you believe
Oh.
it? You did it. And so I think like the best thing we can do is model that kind of thing for our kids. And so like I'll say to my kids, "Oh, I'm really nervous to, go do this podcast interview or this talk." And then I go do it anyway. "Oh, I'm so worried they're going to think I'm boring." And then after they'll say, "How did it go?" "Great. I was
Oh.
nervous, but I did it anyway." So I think that the more that we can, they do what we do, they don't do what we say.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations, by the way, but
Thanks.
I love that your son I love that, the
Isn't that
modeling. That's
cute?
such a cool
And then he tried
cool
again because he's
Oh.
never gotten up either, and this was the first year he tried, and he wasn't sure he was gonna try again, but then because I got up, he tried again.
Oh, how
Yeah,
cool is that?
yeah.
Oh my gosh, I kinda wanna even go further into that story, but before we send folks to the quiz again and where they can find more about Imposter No More, what are your parting thoughts? That's a pretty powerful story about your son and the modeling, but what else would you add that you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Well, I mean, I think we've said most of it. If I had to sum it up in like a pithy little line, and this actually I did a podcast interview and the woman said, "Would it be fair to say do it scared?" And I was like, "Yes, that pretty much sums up everything that we've talked about." So I think I would like to
Okay,
share that message, which is do it scared. Like,
okay.
fear is an emotion that your body is trying to tell you you're in danger, but it's often a false alarm. And so
Mm,
we can like feel one way and do something else. And I actually let me add one other thing to that too is I'll
please.
end on this metaphor that I love, which is if you think about your journey in life as, you're a ship who's sailing through the sea and the fog rolls in, right? In the fog, your thoughts, your feelings, your pain, it is so thick you can't even see your hand in front of your face. And it seems like the only choice you have is to drop anchor and to wait for that fog to clear. Except that what if it never clears? Now you're just stuck and you're not
Mm.
journeying, you're stagnant. And there is a way forward even through that fog, and it's the lighthouse. And those are your values. So if you look to that beacon of values to guide you, even when your thoughts and feelings create this thick fog, you can keep moving forward on this meaningful and fulfilling journey that is life.
Wow.
So I'll end on that.
And I love lighthouses. So that is the perfect
Me too.
way to end that because I love the symbolism of them and all that they entail. So go to your website. Is that where you want folks to find out more about Imposter No More as well as the quiz you mentioned?
Everything is on my website at jillstoddard.com, or my publisher is actually giving 20% off at the Hachette website. So we can put that
Okay.
in the show notes. And if you use the code Stoddard20, you can get 20% off at the Hachette Book Group website. But otherwise, everything else with me, the quizzes, the books, the podcasts, everything is on my website, jillstoddard.com, and
That's
social media.
awesome. Thank you so much for an intriguing and enlightening. And I have to admit, I've got some homework to do here on myself and my thoughts. I love this conversation, Jill. Thank you so much for your time today. Really grateful for the opportunity to just sit and learn from you this afternoon.
You are so welcome, and thank you so much for having me. There's nothing I love more than nerding out about this stuff. So thanks
Yes,
for a great conversation, Cicely.
Thank you.
Boom.